Har Dayal. After reading your book, I find him very controversial. He was there
Yep.
briefly for a few months and then he disappears to Germany.
Yep.
But in India, most of the authors treat him as like the big father or icon of the struggle, but looked like he was working for Germans. What are your thoughts on Har Dayal?
Har Dayal was briefly involved in the group that went to Germany. He didn't even stay there long. And then within a few years, basically recanted his revolutionary stance.
So basically, you're saying he gave up on the revolution and settled in England. So Dayal ਉਹਨੂੰ ਨਾ ਜਦੋਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਛੋਟੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਸੀ ਇੰਡੀਆ 'ਚ ਤਾਂ ਬੜਾ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਸੀ ਵੀ ਉਹ ਬਹੁਤ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਵੱਡਾ ਰੋਲ ਸੀਗਾ, ਬੜਾ ਅੱਛਾ ਬੁਲਾਰਾ ਸੀ, ਪੜ੍ਹਿਆ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਸੀ, ਉਹ ਕੋਈ ਸ਼ੱਕ ਨਹੀਂ। ਪਰ ਉਹ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ 4 ਕੁ ਮਹੀਨੇ ਹੀ ਗਦਰ ਪਾਰਟੀ 5 ਮਹੀਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਐਸੋਸੀਏਸ਼ਨ ਰਹੀ ਆ, ਤੇ ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਉਹ ਇੱਥੋਂ ਡਰ ਕੇ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਇੰਗਲੈਂਡ ਵਾਲਿਆਂ ਨੇ ਸ਼ਿਕਾਇਤ ਲਾਈ, ਉਹ ਜਰਮਨੀ ਚਲਾ ਗਿਆ ਸੀ, ਤੇ ਜਰਮਨੀ ਤੋਂ ਫਿਰ ਵਾਪਸ ਉਹ ਇੰਗਲੈਂਡ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਉਹਨੇ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਗਦਰ ਪਾਰਟੀ ਨੂੰ ਛੱਡ ਕੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਰਿਨਾਊਂਸ ਕਰਤਾ ਸੀ। That's what Johanna is saying.
So those rumors were about Punjabis were stealing jobs. Punjabis were spreading disease. Punjabis were threatening white women. All the things, typical things.
ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਰਿਊਮਰਸ ਤੋਂ ਹੀ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਹੋਈ ਕਿ ਇਸ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਵੀ ਇਹ ਸਾਡੀਆਂ ਜੌਬਾਂ ਖੋਹ ਲੈਂਦੇ ਆ, ਇੱਦਾਂ ਕਰਦੇ ਆ, ਉਹ ਸਾਰੀਆਂ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਉਹ ਵਾਪਰੀਆਂ, ਤੇ ਫਿਰ ਉਹ ਸਾਰਾ ਕੁਛ ਹੋਇਆ ਬੜੇ ਥੋੜ੍ਹੇ ਜਿਹੇ ਸਮੇਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ। ਆਪਣੇ ਸਰੋਤਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਲਈ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਕੰਗ ਆਪਾਂ ਇਹ ਵੀ ਥੋੜ੍ਹਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਦੱਸਦੇ ਜਾਈਏ ਵੀ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾਤਰ ਆਈ ਥਿੰਕ ਐਂਟੀ ਹਿੰਦੂ ਰਾਈਟਸ ਦੇ ਤੌਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਵੀ ਦੇਖਿਆ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਸੀਗਾ, ਪਰ ਮੈਜੋਰਟੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਸਿੱਖ ਬੰਦੇ ਸੀ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਅਤਿਆਚਾਰ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਸਹਿਣਾ ਪਿਆ ਸੀ।
Skin color, religion, what country you come from, and that's also always a moving target, which I think helps us understand that race is a moving target because it's just based on people's opinions, because at that point it was still run by the British authorities from England, right? It was not an independent country at that point. They were cracking down on Indians and in very harsh ways, preventing them from landing in the country, and they formed a special police force to be able to target Punjabis, and it was a secret police force. That secret police force was working the major ports. It was small, and part of the way it spread its resources or used them most effectively was to concentrate in the big ports: San Francisco, Seattle, Vancouver, British Columbia.
ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਰੇਡੀਓ USA, ਪੰਜਾਬੀ TV USA ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਆਪ ਸਭ ਦਾ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ। ਮੈਂ ਰਾਜਕਨਵੀਰ ਸਿੰਘ। ਅੱਜ ਦਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਹੀ ਇਹ ਖਾਸ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਆਪਾਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਲਈ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਹਾਜ਼ਰ ਹੋਏ ਹਾਂ। ਇਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਕਰਨੀ ਆ ਇੱਕ ਆਥਰ ਜੋਐਨਾ ਆਗਡਨ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ, ਤੇ ਨਾਲ ਆਪਣੇ ਇਸ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਾਥ ਦੇਣ ਦੇ ਲਈ ਜੁੜ ਚੁੱਕੇ ਨੇ ਯੂਬਾ ਸਿਟੀ ਤੋਂ ਮੰਨੇ ਪਰਮੰਨੇ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਜਸਬੀਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਕੰਗ ਜੀ। ਕੰਗ ਸਾਹਿਬ, ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਜੀ ਆਇਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ। ਸਤਿ ਸ਼੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ ਜੀ।
ਸਤਿ ਸ਼੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ ਜੀ।
So with us we have today author Johanna Ogden. Her latest book, Punjabi Rebels of Columbia River. We'll be discussing this book today. ਨਾਲ ਹੀ ਇਹ ਵੀ ਦੱਸਦੇ ਜਾਈਏ ਵੀ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਪੰਜਾਬੀਆਂ ਦਾ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਖਾਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਕੈਲੀਫੋਰਨੀਆ 'ਚ, ਵੈਸਟ ਕੋਸਟ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ, ਅਮਰੀਕਾ 'ਚ, ਕੈਨੇਡਾ 'ਚ ਬਹੁਤ ਪੁਰਾਣਾ ਆ। ਅੱਜ ਦੇ ਇਸ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਦੇ ਜ਼ਰੀਏ ਆਪਾਂ ਉਸ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਨੂੰ ਫਰੋਲਣ ਦੀ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਕਰਨੀ ਆ। ਕਿਉਂ ਇਹ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਮਹੱਤਤਾ ਰੱਖਦਾ ਆ, ਕੀ ਇਸ ਦੀ ਇੰਪੋਰਟੈਂਸ ਆ, ਅਤੇ ਅੱਜ ਜਿਸ ਸ਼ੇਪ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਪਣੀ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਇੱਥੇ ਪਹੁੰਚੀ ਹੋਈ ਆ, ਜਿਸ ਰੂਪ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆ, ਇਹ ਨੀਂਹ ਪੱਥਰ ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਦਾ ਸੀਗਾ ਅਤੇ ਇਸ ਨੇ ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਦਾ ਯੋਗਦਾਨ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਪਾਇਆ ਆ। ਸੋ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਕੰਗ ਹੁਣਾਂ ਦੇ ਦੁਆਰਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਅਮਰੀਕਨ ਹੈਰੀਟੇਜ ਸੁਸਾਇਟੀ ਵੀ ਉੱਥੇ ਚਲਾਈ ਜਾਂਦੀ ਆ ਯੂਬਾ ਸਿਟੀ 'ਚ, ਉੱਥੇ ਮਿਊਜ਼ੀਅਮ ਵੀ ਆ। ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਸਿੱਖ ਪਾਇਨੀਅਰਸ ਵਾਲੀ ਇੱਕ ਕਿਤਾਬ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆਪਣੇ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਉੱਥੇ ਛਾਪੀ ਹੋਈ ਆ, ਉਹ ਵੀ ਕਿਉਂ ਇੰਪੋਰਟੈਂਟ ਆ, ਇਹ ਕਿੱਥੋਂ ਇਹ ਨਿਕਲ ਕੇ ਆ ਰਹੀਆਂ ਗੱਲਾਂ, ਉਹਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ। ਸੋ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਕੰਗ, ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਬੇਨਤੀ ਕਰੂੰਗਾ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਜੋਹੈਨਾ ਆਗਡਨ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਥੋੜ੍ਹਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਦੱਸੋ ਅਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਜੀ ਆਇਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਆਖੋ ਅੱਜ ਦੇ ਇਸ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ।
ਥੈਂਕ ਯੂ ਰਾਜ। ਸੋ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸਾਡੀ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਜੋਹਾਨਾ ਜੀ ਨਾਲ ਹੋਏਗੀ ਉਹ ਇੰਗਲਿਸ਼ 'ਚ ਹੋਏਗੀ, ਅਸੀਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਵਿਚਾਲੇ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ 'ਚ ਵੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ। ਸੋ ਆਈ ਐਮ ਰੀਅਲੀ ਡਿਲਾਈਟਡ ਐਂਡ ਓਨਰਡ ਟੂ ਵੈਲਕਮ ਆਵਰ ਗੈਸਟ Johanna Ogden. She is an independent historian and an activist. She lives in Portland, in state of Oregon. And I had an honor to visit her lovely home and meet her significant other about a couple of years ago. So welcome, Johanna.
Thank you. I so appreciate this opportunity and the invitation. Thank you both.
So Johanna wrote a book, which you already mentioned. It's very well written book, very detailed, and it brought many new facts about the history of our people in America. The name of book is Punjabi Rebels of Columbia River, the global fight for Indian independence and citizenship. So we often talk about the Ghadar party, but we sometimes forget that the struggle was not just for the independence from British, but the struggle was also to gain our rights in America as U.S. citizens. So, Johanna, what inspired you to write this book? You are from Portland, far away from most of the Indian or Punjabi diaspora. So, what inspired you to put your 10 years of your life writing this book?
Well, I think questions about citizenship and immigration and colonialism have been kind of shaped my life, most of my life. They've been of interest to me. 9/11 was a really important event for me also in terms of watching how quickly attitudes in a country openly shift, not that they weren't that way anyway, and how people who were previously accepted in a society are suddenly domestic enemies, and how many, both the state apparatus that went after people, and I'm sure people know that one of the first hate crimes afterwards was against Balbar Sodhi Singh, a Sikh man in, I believe, Arizona. So those were the shaping questions for me, and I started the book quite some time after 9/11, but those were I had an opportunity to go to graduate school late in life, obviously. And I had an opportunity to sort of dig into this, and the good fortune to run into another scholar here at Reed College, who was the first person that said, with your interests, I would look into the history about Sikhs in Oregon. And he didn't know much more about it than that. And so once I kind of started digging around, it's just a story that captured me. I mean, it's an amazing story. And I think one of the biggest things that captured me is it was clear from the beginning, it was a huge story that almost none of us knew. And I'd made it my business over the years to know stories that most people didn't know. So that's a long answer to a short question.
That's very inspiring. So, Columbia River. So, I mean, for our audience, this is a river right on the border of Oregon and Washington State, and it kind of gets into Pacific Ocean right at the city Astoria. So, before we get to Astoria, tell us a little bit how many people were here, like in early 1900s. I mean, based on your research, when the people started migrating from Punjab to Pacific West, and what were the reasons which made them migrate?
Well, the Columbia River, as you said, runs all the way from Canada and then forms the border between Washington State and Oregon State. And it runs all the way out to the ocean. It's a gigantic river. It's also one of my favorite places on earth. So that was a big upside for the story for me, traveling along there. There were probably, I think most historians that are in this field think there were maybe around 8,000 Punjabi, mainly Punjabis, that were in North America. And I'm saying North America because in that I'm including British Columbia. The population was exclusively really on the west coast of North America. In Oregon itself, I think max around 500 people. And I think it's important to say here that people in Oregon, the men who, and it was overwhelmingly men, like 99%, were secondary migrants, meaning, and by that I mean they didn't sail directly from India to Oregon. They sailed directly to San Francisco or Seattle or Vancouver, British Columbia, and largely because of violence in those places and lack of employment, people, they were secondary migrants to Oregon. And that also gets at somewhat some of the, all of these places were, the story traces global colonialism. It wasn't just the British, but there was a colonial regime here. It was based in white supremacy. And that was true across the West Coast. But to say that doesn't mean it was the same in every place, that it was carried out in the same way. And I think that ends up being important in the story of the migrants, the men who ended up here in Oregon. So they were driven out largely by violence in other places and lack of employment, and came to Oregon in part because it had the promise of safety and employment, not because they weren't white supremacists here running the state, but they had a little different take on how best to do that.
So if you look at that time, the borders were pretty porous, so people migrated back and forth between
Yeah,
Canada and Washington.
exactly.
So since our focus is on the rebels, so what really led those simple people who came here to work, make some money, and go back home, but they ended up becoming rebels? What
What
can
prompted
you
them?
go through certain
Hmm.
incidents which really precipitated for ordinary people to become rebels?
I think that's a really important question. And I think your emphasis on ordinary people is also really important. And I think it's relevant to today. And a brief note on that is that these were people that were routinely underestimated. It's like thinking about Starbucks workers or Amazon, workers in the warehouses being the ones who led a revolution, right? So that would be the equivalent today. So I think it was a combination of things. I think many people came here with the hopes of both helping and their family situation back in India. I think North America, because of the havoc that colonialism unleashed across India, but certainly very much so in Punjab in terms of the debt, the famines, the disease, and the just pretty brutal suppression against people. There was a good reason people wanted to leave. And also in North America, it was the engine of industrialism in the world at that time. And we're talking about the early 1900s. So there was the whole promise of, this is kind of the promised land for opportunity, right? And a lot of the people who came, maybe half of them, were military veterans. So they had the experience of traveling around the world and seeing new places. And, as I'm sure many people know, immigration is sort of a team tag, right? You sort of like, I know somebody there, I'm going there, and that's part of what happens. So I think that's in part why people ended up here. And then their experience once they got here, I mean, I think all of us in bigger or smaller ways have had dreams in our life. And then when you come against certain realities about what's possible with that dreams, those are important crossings for you as a human, right? And so part of what those dreams hit was when they came to North America, both Canada and Western US, they were still treated as colonized people. And they were racially castigated, they were secondary, they weren't allowed to be citizens, all the things that went along. So, and a big part of that was the violence that was unleashed against them in various places. In 1907 in particular, a lot of that violence was fueled by rumors. I think all of us today are all too familiar with the power of rumors and how those spread and what they can trigger. So those rumors were about Punjabis were stealing jobs. Punjabis were spreading disease. Punjabis were threatening white women, all the things, typical things. And so in 1907, there was a particular uptick in what I call communal violence. In other words, not just one-on-one violence, but groups of people attacking other groups of people based on who they were. And one of the biggest one was in Bellingham, Washington, which is close to the border to British Columbia, on Labor Day of all things, which I think is also important. A mob of several hundred, mainly white men, attacked Punjabis and drove them out of town. Sort of tragically, there were a number of those men who then walked to British Columbia thinking they'd get back under the Crown lands and be safe. And less than a week or two later, they were attacked once again. And at that point, it was the biggest riot that had ever happened in British Columbia. Something like 10,000 people were involved. And these were not just laborers, these were ministers, they were politicians. And so that's a lot of what they meant. And so when I said that Punjabis that came to Oregon were secondary migrants, that violence I described sort of spilled out across the states. It didn't just stay in those cities, it hit smaller cities. And like any sane person, people were looking around for where was it safe to go. And was part of what popped up because there was a terrible, heinous crime here, but there wasn't the mass community violence against Indians. And so the word went out. That's when, in the wake of that violence in 1907, people started showing up in much bigger numbers here in Oregon. And the fact that there was work, because the Oregon, for reasons I can go into if people are interested, Oregon was expanding very rapidly and they needed laborers, right? And so that's sort of what came together about why they got here. The problem is about 3 years after, in other words, in 1910, there was again a riot, only this time it was in Oregon, and that was in St. John's, Oregon, which is sort of on the north end of Portland. It was an independent city. It's now a part of Portland. And I think with round two, people were like, yeah, no, we're not doing this again. We're not going to run. They didn't run. They didn't leave. They were just like, one, they forced, partly because they could in Oregon, some legal repercussions. There were trials here. But they also, after those trials, which lasted more or less 2 years, they started studying. They were like, why does this keep happening to us? Why? What should we do in the wake of it? So I think it was that kind of, it was too much, all of it put together. And
so
like,
what you're saying, the trigger point was Bellingham incident. And that was the beginning. And actually, by the way, there were 5 Jawls who came to Yuba City in 1907. And 2 of the families I personally know, Dr. Jawl's family and Kulwant Singh Jawal. So Dr. Jawl's father, Tulli Singh Jawal, was there. And Dr. Jawal is now 101 year old.
it's amazing.
And Kulwant Jawal's grandfather I'm just like a personal connection. So Bellingham pushed them to other cities. So they didn't get welcomed in Canada. And then they came to Oregon. As you're saying, the Oregon was relatively safer, a little bit away because they needed more labor. So now they get the same problem in St. John's. They get attacked. So there was also a gentleman named Har Singh who got killed. You remember something about that?
Correct. And that was the incident I mentioned that happened here in Oregon in 1907, that it was a terrible crime, but it wasn't like, it didn't involve hundreds of people. And what happened there is in 1907 in a community The town is called Boring. It's about 30 miles east of Portland, and it was a lumber mill town. And again, it was on Halloween night in 1907, and basically a group of tree cutters and mill workers, a small group, maybe 10 or 12, went to the bar, got liquored up, sort of started repeating all the rumors that were going on about all the terrible things that Punjabis were doing about stealing their livelihood, because one Indian man had just been hired at the local mill, and they were like, oh, this is a bad sign. They're going to take all of our jobs. They went to the mill, they went to the bar, they got liquored up, they went to pick up all their guns, went to the store, got ammunition, came back to the mill camp, and started opening fire on the bunkhouse where Harnam and his brother and another man were staying. And they sort of surrounded the perimeter of that cabin. The first time they shot, they hit the roof. They didn't get the response they wanted. They took a few more and, basically ended up shooting Harnam Singh through his upper thigh. And he was hospitalized. Again, it's a horrible, horrible crime. And what's interesting, though, is, and I use that word carefully, is that local authorities made sure he got medical care. They got him to Portland for better medical care. The British authorities stepped in to make sure he was brought to legal consequence, that the people who attacked Harnam Singh, because he later died from his injuries, the men were put up on murder charges. And the people that paid for the attorneys that defended the Indians was the Crown. And it was done through the local British consulate here. Now, from my research and my reading of events, I don't think that's because they were being nice. I think they were trying to cool the anger out, like the saviors. And part of the thing is, in Oregon, they could get local authorities to join them in that effort. Whereas in 1907, they also tried, like the council, his name was Laidlaw, that was based here in Portland. He went up to Bellingham, tried to talk to officials up there, and they were just either too scared to bring charges because they didn't want to go against the flow. They also likely just agreed with it. And so the British consulate could not get any traction there. In Canada, they had that's a whole nother kettle of fish, but they were bringing down all sorts of draconian things on Indians up in Canada after 1907. But in Oregon, the consulate could get some traction with local authorities to prosecute the people that murdered Harnam Singh. And that's why I think the word in part went out to other Punjabis that in a landscape of really bad options, Oregon looked better. There was just a murder, but at least something was done about it.
So let's now move forward.
ਡਾਕਟਰ ਕੰਗ, ਜੇ ਆਪਾਂ ਥੋੜਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਆਪਾਂ ਮਾੜਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਦੱਸ ਦਈਏ ਵੀ ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਜੋਹਾਨਾ ਹੁਣਾਂ ਨੇ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਵੀ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਆਪਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਬੈਲਿੰਗਹੈਮ ਰਾਈਟਸ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਸੇਂਟ ਜੌਨ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਰਾਈਟਸ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਤੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਹਰਨਾਮ ਸਿੰਘ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸਟੋਰੀ ਦੱਸੀ ਆ, ਮੈਂ ਤਾਂ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ 'ਚ ਵੀ ਥੋੜ੍ਹੀ ਜਿਹੀ ਨਾਲ ਆਪਾਂ ਕਰਦੇ ਜਾਵਾਂ ਵੀ ਕਿਉਂ ਇਹ ਇੰਪੋਰਟੈਂਟ ਆ ਰਾਈਟ ਨਾਓ। ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਰਿਊਮਰਸ ਤੋਂ ਹੀ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਹੋਈ ਕਿ ਇਸ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਵੀ ਇਹ ਸਾਡੀਆਂ ਜੋਬਾਂ ਖੋਹ ਲੈਂਦੇ ਆ, ਇੱਦਾਂ ਕਰਦੇ ਆ, ਉਹ ਸਾਰੀਆਂ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਉਹ ਵਾਪਰੀਆਂ, ਤੇ ਫਿਰ ਉਹ ਸਾਰਾ ਕੁਛ ਹੋਇਆ ਬੜੇ ਥੋੜ੍ਹੇ ਜਿਹੇ ਸਮੇਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ। ਆਪਣੇ ਸਰੋਤਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਲਈ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਕੰਗ ਆਪਾਂ ਇਹ ਵੀ ਥੋੜ੍ਹਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਦੱਸਦੇ ਜਾਈਏ ਵੀ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾਤਰ ਆਈ ਥਿੰਕ ਐਂਟੀ ਹਿੰਦੂ ਰਾਈਟਸ ਦੇ ਤੌਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਵੀ ਦੇਖਿਆ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਸੀਗਾ, ਪਰ ਮੈਜੋਰਟੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਸਿੱਖ ਬੰਦੇ ਸੀ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਅਤਿਆਚਾਰ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਸਹਿਣਾ ਪਿਆ ਸੀ। ਡਾਕਟਰ ਕੰਗ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਥੋੜਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਇਸ ਨੂੰ
ਹੈਗਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਰਾਜ ਕਹਿ ਰਹੇ ਹੋ ਨਾ, ਉਦੋਂ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਹਿੰਦੁਸਤਾਨ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਤੋਂ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਲੋਕ ਆਏ ਸੀ, ਹਿੰਦੁਸਤਾਨੀਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਹਿੰਦੂ ਆਖਿਆ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਸੀ, ਭਾਵੇਂ ਉਹ ਕਿਸੇ ਉਹ ਰਿਲੀਜੀਅਸ ਇੱਕ ਆਇਡੈਂਟੀਟੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਸੀ, that was a more of a region like
Place,
India ਵੀ ਕਿਹਾ
region.
ਜਾਂਦਾ ਸੀ ਬ੍ਰਿਟਿਸ਼ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਤੇ ਹਿੰਦੁਸਤਾਨ ਵੀ ਉਦੋਂ ਵਰਡ ਯੂਜ਼ ਕਾਫੀ ਕੀਤਾ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਸੀ ਸੋ ਜਿਹੜੇ 1907 ਵਿੱਚ ਬੈਲਹਿੰਗਮ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੋਈ ਐਜ਼ ਜਿਵੇਂ ਜੋਹਾਨਾ ਨੇ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਹੈਗਾ ਵੀ ਆਪਣੇ 250-300 ਬੰਦਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਉੱਥੋਂ ਆ ਕੇ ਕੱਢ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਗਿਆ ਕੁੱਟ ਮਾਰ ਕੇ
Hmm.
ਕੁਛ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ 'ਚ ਗਏ ਉੱਥੇ ਵੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਉਹੀ ਕੁਛ ਹੋਇਆ ਤੇ ਫਿਰ ਕੁਛ ਉਹ
ਵਾਪਸ ਆ
ਓਰੇਗਨ
ਗਏ।
ਚਲੇ ਗਏ ਸੇਂਟ
Hmm.
ਜੌਨ ਉੱਥੇ ਵੀ ਇਹੀ ਕੁਛ ਹੋਇਆ ਤੇ ਇੱਕ ਬੰਦੇ ਨੂੰ ਮਾਰ ਵੀ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਇਦਾਂ ਹੀ ਬਿਨਾਂ ਜਿਵੇਂ ਵੀ ਝੂਠੇ ਜਿਵੇਂ ਜਿਹਨੂੰ ਆਪਾਂ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਆ ਨਾ ਅਫਵਾਹਾਂ ਫੈਲਾ ਕੇ ਜਿਵੇਂ ਅੱਜ
ਅਫਵਾਹਾਂ
ਕੱਲ੍ਹ ਵੀ ਅਫਵਾਹਾਂ ਫੈਲਾਈਆਂ ਜਾਂਦੀਆਂ ਜੀ ਫਲਾਣੇ
ਦੇ।
ਦੇਸ਼ ਦੇ ਲੋਕ ਇਦਾਂ ਕਰਦੇ ਨੇ ਸੋ ਅਫਵਾਹਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਇੱਕ ਨੈਰੇਟਿਵ ਇੱਕ ਵਰਤਾਂਤ ਬਣਾ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਗਿਆ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਦੇ ਖਿਲਾਫ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਭੜਕਾ ਕੇ ਸੋ ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਹਿੰਸਾ ਆਪਣੇ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਦੇ ਖਿਲਾਫ ਹੋਈ ਸੋ ਅੱਗੇ
ਡਾਕਟਰ
ਚੱਲਦੇ
ਕੰਗ,
ਹੋਏ
ਮੈਂ ਕੁਐਸਚਨ ਪੁੱਛ ਸਕਦਾ ਇੱਕ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇੱਥੇ?
ਸ਼ੋਰ
Yeah. Joanna, I just want to ask you now, the way you described how it was in the 1907s, like the rumor mills were running hot, and do you see the same thing happening right now? Like, is the same kind of atmosphere being created against these kind of immigrants?
Absolutely, 100%. And let me just step back 1 minute and just clarify something I said, because the other violence that happened in 1907 in Washington, British Columbia, there was no criminal repercussions for anyone. There were no charges, there were no trials. So the fact that there was a trial in Oregon was extremely important. So I don't think I made that clear. But absolutely 100%, I think it's happening again. And the US has this history of these cycles of, anti-certain kind of immigrant violence, not all immigrants, certain immigrants, and it's the racial test. And that racial test is always, skin color, religion, what country you come from. And that's also always a moving target, which I think helps us understand that race is a moving target because it's just based on people's opinions. It's not based on anything in nature. It's stuff we make up and we put in our laws, And this country was founded as a white supremacist country, It was founded on trying to dispossess natives altogether of their lands. It was funded by the labor of people enslaved from Africa, And so it's been this dynamic from the get-go about needing the labor of people all over the world, but not having the legal apparatus and the popular opinion, unfortunately, that those same people should not be full members of society. And I think that's absolute. So this is part of what we're seeing with the ICE raids right now, right? People who have been here for decades, making all kinds of contributions, members of the community in so many ways are now being told, rounded up, basically. And yeah, 100%, I think it's repeating, and that goes across a multitude of communities. Certainly the Indian community, though, I think there's work to be done to sort of understand that the community's vulnerable too, but the Latinx community, I volunteer for legal observing around ICE up here in Portland, and it's a broad swath of people, that they're going after these days. So
Johanna, I know it's a very touchy issue, but let's go back to the history. So you shared the background. So now some people get together in Astoria, which is like very nondescript place. A lot of people don't even know where it is until I heard about it, but never been there until I visited you and went there to see that plaque was placed in 2013 to honor the Ghadar party's formation. So I have a very straightforward question: why they picked a Finnish socialist hall to meet, and why the party was formed in Astoria, nowhere else?
So like all of this, it's got a lot of pieces to be able to answer that. I mentioned earlier that what was happening up in British Columbia, because at that point it was still run by the British authorities from England, right? It was not an independent country at that point. They were cracking down on Indians and in very harsh ways, preventing them from landing in the country. And they formed a special police force to be able to target Punjabis, and it was a secret police force. And that secret police force was working the major ports. It was small, and part of the way it spread its resources or used them most effectively was to concentrate in the big ports: San Francisco, Seattle, Vancouver, British Columbia. Portland is not that kind of a port.
Mhm.
So Oregon was a little wasn't really on the radar for the secret police force. It was also a laboring community. There were not intellectuals here, except for a few here and there, but it wasn't like San Francisco, wasn't like British Columbia in that regard. So that's one part of the backdrop here, is the police force that was being mustered by the British regime against Punjabis.
So what you're saying is that Astoria was not under scrutiny like the bigger cities were.
Correct. And I mentioned the riot in 1910 in St. John's, which again, also on the Columbia River or near the Columbia River in Oregon. Astoria is at the mouth of the Columbia River, about 2 hours downriver towards the ocean. So both St. John's and Astoria had about the same size Indian communities, around 150 people in each one. In Astoria, there was never any communal violence against Indians there.
Okay.
And I think that was because, in part, you asked about the Finns. Astoria had a particular, it both had a lot of radicals in it, the Finnish Socialist Halls where Ghadar had its founding meeting, and it also had a long history. There was sort of this odd feeling that Astoria, which was a fishing community, also why the Finns were there in large part, and it was a lumbering community. And there was this recognition that if we drive these people out of our town, our livelihood is at risk. And so they did not have the same sort of violence happen there as happened, for example, in St. John's. I'm not saying that there wasn't racism going on. I'm not going that far, but I think there's some of these state and regional differences that are important. So I think, and as a historian, you have to make educated guesses. You can't always, it's really hard to get people's intentions. But I think as organizers, the idea was hatched in the back of, in a machine shop in St. John's about, we got to form an organization. Har Dayal had come up from San Francisco, a radical, very well-known leader at that point in the Indian community. And they said, okay, we're going to form this organization. And then they made the decision about where they get the most support, where it was safe. And I think it's worth pausing for a minute and thinking about when they convened in Astoria, Indians ran advertisements in the local Astoria paper saying, we're going to organize this party. We want all of you to come, which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about the atmosphere. And so I hope that answered.
I mean, I had the chance to visit that place on your recommendation. And just for our viewers, if you ever get a chance, Astoria is a beautiful city on the ocean. And there is a museum. They still have some old history related to Ghadar Party there. And they also have a plaque honoring the formation of Ghadar Party. I think the plaque was placed on 100-year celebration, and I believe you were there.
Yes.
You were involved with that. So you mentioned Har Dayal, but I mean, after reading your book, if I find him very controversial. He was there
Yep.
briefly for a few months and then he disappears to Germany.
Yep.
But in India, most of the authors treat him as like the big father or icon of the struggle, but looked like he was working for Germans. What are your thoughts on Har Dayal?
You know, he was a complicated person. You know, through my research, partly because of where I'm researching, I am based here in Oregon. The party started here in Oregon. It included at that convention in Astoria. It's important to say people came from California, they came from British Columbia. It wasn't just people from up and down the Columbia River. But they were laborers. That's who was driving this. So, you know, there's a certain controversy amongst people who do the research that I'm involved in about Ghadar. Some tend to ascribe it was all intellectuals, it was all created by them. I don't think the records support that. I think Har Dayal, he was an intellectual. He was trained at Oxford for a long time. He was a very renowned speaker he went to Paris for a while. He was a renowned writer and speaker in all of these places. I think he felt very at home in radical intellectual circles. And I'm not trying to demean those at all. I think they're important to any, but I think it took him 6 months to get up here after laborers invited him to come address them. So it was not big on his radar, for starters. And secondly, you know, there was a lot of back and forth in that meeting in St. John's about, are we just going to found another paper? Or are we actually going to do something? And the people that were voicing, we actually want to do something, were the laborers, I believe, looking at the records that I saw. So I think in many ways, Har Dayal I think he lent prestige and weight to the laborers and a background that's very important to the laborers' desires. I think he was also a convert too, because I think it was the first time when he was in London and in Paris and in San Francisco, he was not around a bunch of radicalized laborers who were saying, we're done with this regime. We don't want to put up with this anymore. So, and when the party was formed in Astoria in 1913, by the end of that year, they'd established an office in San Francisco. They started a newspaper. There's a newspaper in our parlance of today went viral. You know, it was distributed around the world. And Har Dayal's speech at the Finnish Socialist Hall at the founding of Ghadar he predicted it was going to be 10 years before the revolution would start. And it ended up being less than 2 years because World War I broke out. The strategy of Ghadar was that World War I was their opportunity. And their logic was the Brits were going to be tied up with another imperial power, i.e. Germany. They were going to need the Indian troops, which were renowned for their fighting capability. Many of them disproportionately were Punjabi. So within less than 2 years, the call went out to people all across North America and the world to go back to India and try to start the mutiny. So, and at that point, there was pretty much a split in the party. It was primarily and overwhelmingly laborers who went back to India. Many of the intellectuals from the organization, and again, intellectuals are important. They, you know, lent a lot of important things to the movement. There was thinking that they needed the assistance of Germany, its funding and logistics, to be able to make this revolution happen. The Germans, I think, and others are on the same page, I think, the Germans just were trying to stir up trouble for the Brits. In other words, to have a fight in India while they were trying to fight Germany was to the Germans' benefit, right? So Har Dayal was briefly involved in the group that went to Germany. He didn't even stay there long. And then within a few years, basically recanted his revolutionary stance. He died before he was able to get back to India, which is what he had hoped to do. But
So
that's what
basically, so basically, you're saying he gave up on the revolution and settled in England. So let's move along. So the
ਡਾਕਟਰ
people,
ਕੰਗ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਥੋੜਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਐਕਸਪਲੇਨ ਕਰ ਦਿਓ ਵੀ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਸਵਾਲ ਕਿਉਂ ਇੰਪੋਰਟੈਂਟ ਆ ਵੀ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਹਰਦਿਆਲ ਦੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਲਾਲੇ ਹਰਦਿਆਲ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਵੀ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਪੇਸ਼ ਕਿਸ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਨਾਲ ਕੀਤਾ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਆ ਤੇ ਅਸਲੀਅਤ ਉਹਦੀ ਥੋੜੀ ਜਿਹੀ ਕੀ ਹੈ ਜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਥੋੜਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਇਸ ਤੇ 1-2 ਮਿੰਟ ਲਾ ਕੇ ਥੋੜਾ ਚਾਨਣਾ ਪਾਉਣ ਦੀ
ਜਿਹੜਾ
ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਕਰਿਓ
ਹਰਦਿਆਲ ਆ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਨਾ ਜਦੋਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਛੋਟੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਸੀ ਇੰਡੀਆ 'ਚ ਤਾਂ ਬੜਾ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਸੀ ਵੀ ਉਹ ਬਹੁਤ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਵੱਡਾ ਰੋਲ ਸੀਗਾ, ਬੜਾ ਅੱਛਾ ਬੁਲਾਰਾ ਸੀ, ਪੜ੍ਹਿਆ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਸੀ, ਉਹ ਕੋਈ ਸ਼ੱਕ ਨਹੀਂ।
ਹੂੰ
ਪਰ ਉਹ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ 4 ਕੁ ਮਹੀਨੇ ਹੀ ਗਦਰ ਪਾਰਟੀ 5 ਮਹੀਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਐਸੋਸੀਏਸ਼ਨ ਰਹੀ ਆ ਤੇ ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਉਹ ਇੱਥੋਂ ਡਰ ਕੇ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਇੰਗਲੈਂਡ ਵਾਲਿਆਂ ਨੇ ਸ਼ਿਕਾਇਤ ਲਾਈ, ਉਹ ਜਰਮਨੀ ਚਲਾ ਗਿਆ ਸੀ ਤੇ ਜਰਮਨੀ ਤੋਂ ਫਿਰ ਵਾਪਸ ਉਹ ਇੰਗਲੈਂਡ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਉਹਨੇ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਗਦਰ ਪਾਰਟੀ ਨੂੰ ਛੱਡ ਕੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਰਿਨਾਊਂਸ ਕਰਤਾ ਸੀ। That's what Johanna is saying. So I think so he did play a role in the beginning, but he was not as a big hero as he's made by some writers. So I think there were much bigger heroes. We're gonna get to those. So
Sure.
so Johanna, recently you mentioned to me a few days ago that the founding president of party was Sohan Singh Pakhana and treasurer was Kansi Ram. And Kansi Ram was basically hanged in Lahore, and Sohan Singh Pakhana spent almost close to 2 decades of his life in the jail.
Yeah.
So those were real genuine
Founders.
heroes, and so Johanna, you mentioned there's some recent recognition about Sohan Singh in Oregon. Can you please let us know what recently happened?
So one of the gratifying things for me is when people are talking about this history and do it without me being a part of it. It just means it's getting some traction in the community. And so there's a group, what used to be a union hall and is now a community organization. And they are putting up a giant that's just is a part of St. John's, and they're putting up a giant mural, 30 feet by 80 feet, of St. John's during the 1910s. And it's going to include, it's based on a 1930s mural that was done of St. John's, but they're redoing it to more accurately represent who was actually in St. John's in 1910. It wasn't all just white people. And one of the characters, they are featuring Sohan Singh Pakhana. So
that's very nice.
Yeah. So
that was a highly revered hero who put all his life struggling for the people's rights and freedom and equality. So now the party is formed. Let's move along. I mean, it's a very interesting and very powerful story, but we have to move along for sake of time. So now party is formed in Oregon, and Sohan Singh Pakhana becomes president, and Har Dayal becomes the secretary, Kansi Ram becomes the treasurer, and now they move to the party activities now move to California, including San Francisco and Stockton Gurdwara. What is the role of Stockton Gurdwara in this struggle from since you mainly focused in Oregon, but you definitely must have come across during your research about Stockton Gurdwara?
So there are people that could address that question much better than I can. I sort of had to pick my lane and stick to it. But, I will say that there were excellent reasons for moving the headquarters to San Francisco. It was a radical center for not just for Indians, Chinese, Mexicans, all kinds of people this was period of time when there were lots of nationalist struggles that were going on, a number of which were organized in this country, not just Indians, right? So it put Ghadar in the middle of that. It also put it in close proximity to the largest population of Indians in the U.S., which was in the Central Valley of California, with the Stockton Gurdwara being a focus of that community, a central organizing point. So I think it was in about December of 2013 that a second major meeting for Ghadar that I think was attended by Sohan Singh Bhakna, amongst others, was organized in Stockton, signing up more recruits, gaining money. I mean, people were just giving everything they had to this movement, not just themselves, but all their finances, their future, everything. So Stockton was extremely important in that, in that.
So to me, the very interesting question, or kind of sometimes hard to understand, how they were able to convince 6 to 8,000 people to sell every possession and go back. Where that inspiration, how it happened, it was amazing.
It really is. And some of the tactics that they used, like, for example, one of their major organizing tactics was poetry. And as you both know, that's a huge tradition. It's also extremely useful for people who are semi-literate or illiterate, because it's something that you can remember and pass on. So it spread the word of the politics of the movement in a very powerful way. And that was one of the most popular publications that Ghadar did. It put together a booklet of poetry. And that, I think it speaks to people were ready. People were tired of it, and you hit with something like and there's the historian that I really learned the most from is in India. His name is Harish Puri, and he talks about, I just lost my thought. He talks about that people went back knowing that the likelihood of winning was slim to none. But they went anyway because they figured if they didn't make that statement then, for the future, it wasn't going to happen, which I find deeply, deeply moving, and reading accounts of, to your point, Jasbir, about how people were going to their bank accounts, emptying everything out. They were selling, one of the ways the British figured out that something was up, there were just fire sales of property up and down the west coast of North America. People were just unloading property to be able to fund this movement. I mean, it was an amazing example of sacrifice for the future. And, I think when people went back, probably half of them just sort of melted into the countryside because they didn't have the organization to support what they were doing, But there was a stalwart core that really tried to sort of forge ahead. And as you mentioned, paid dearly for it too, which is, yeah. But I think
this young man, which is highly celebrated in our community, is Kartar Singh.
Yes.
Saraba. So he was like responsible for the Punjabi section, Ghadar Di Gunj. And I saw that poster in the museum in Astoria. So you have any words for him, about him?
I should know more about him than I do. I don't know that I can add a lot more than what you just said. He was a student at UC Berkeley who was young. He was like 19, 20 something.
Yeah, he got hanged when he was 19.
Yeah. And he, I think it's important to talk about, even though, for me, there's a parallel to like the Black Panthers here in this country. It was not a struggle that, quote, won, but had a long-term effect on politics of this country. And I think from my reading of things, Ghadar was similar in terms of being an open sort of, as the saying goes, a clarion call, that echoed through the years.
So, Johanna, I'm going to give you a benefit because we want to learn more from you about what happened in US. I know there's a second part of the story is what happened in Punjab and India and how 42 people were hanged and some sent to Kalapani and Andaman. But I think I will not go into that chapter. We'll focus on what your expertise is. Your book mentions about British agent William Hopkins and Meva Singh.
Yeah.
Can you share a little bit about both of them?
Well, I mentioned earlier that after the 1907 riots up and down the West Coast in British Columbia, the response of the British was to develop a police force aimed only at and entirely against the Punjabi community. And that was headed by Hopkinson, as you mentioned. And he recruited in the community basically for people to spy on other people they were informants. That's what they were. And they were hated. And that's where Meva Singh comes in. So I think it was 1913, but I could be wrong on that date, that there was an incident in British Columbia in 1908 where in the Gurdwara up there, that one of the veterans who was highly respected and a member of the Gurdwara up there burned his British military medals, which was also meant that he renounced all the privileges that came from him, monetary and otherwise. And there were other veterans who did the same. And the Gurdwara after that banned the wearing of medals at the Gurdwara. And in 1913 or 14, I apologize for not quite remembering the date, one of Hopkinson's agents murdered this veteran.
I think that his name was Pag Singh, who was killed.
Yeah.
I believe he was the president of the
Yes,
Gurdwara.
exactly.
Vancouver Gurdwara.
Yeah. And it ended up that there was a trial in Vancouver about that. And Hopkinson was on the courthouse steps as a part of that trial, and he was shot by Meva Singh. And Hopkinson's death was considered a sort of regional his funeral was
a big loss to British intelligence. Well, he was I was surprised he had connections even in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And he was very influential, though he was working for Canadian immigration. And
in British.
He spoke Punjabi, Hindi, and Bengali because his mom was from India.
Yeah.
And dad was, I believe, Irish or English. I don't know details.
Yeah.
So anyhow, there's recently a movie made on that incident. That's why I mentioned. So moving along, now 7,000 to 8,000 people left the shores. That's a story, second part. But now everybody didn't go there. So now there are people here in America and who are still part of Ghadar party. And I think I really want to go to the citizen side, but before I go there, let's talk a little bit about German Hindu conspiracy case and what were the ramifications of that.
Let me just sort of set the stage a little bit, because one thing that I think, another part that Oregon was a little different than other places, British Columbia and California in particular, was pretty much all the Indians cleared out of the state once the call went out in Ghadar to return to India. The few that didn't heed that call largely left and went to other places where communities continued. So I think that's part of the reason the story is not particularly well known, is there was no community here to keep it alive, right? You're raising an important point. in that what the British were doing in India didn't stay in India. Sort of once they, they claimed that they had it all controlled. They put down the revolt, la la la, jailed people, executed people, all the stuff that they did.
Hmm.
They turned their attention to the U.S. and they went after, and they had been, the Brits had been on the U.S. government, and we're talking the highest levels, not just little operatives at the local levels. This is the highest levels of government having these conversations. They had been trying to convince the U.S. government that Indians were a bigger problem than the U.S. wasn't giving them proper attention for the problem that they were. And so the Brits were constantly on the US government, like, you got to do more, you got to do more. So once the war broke out, that opened up some other opportunities for the British to make some inroads in the US government. And in particular, the fact that part of Ghadar was affiliated with the German government meant that there were people here in the US conspiring with an ally of the US government at a time of war. And that opened a whole nother kettle of fish in terms of laws that are available. So they basically, they being the British government and all its various arms, in cahoots with the US government, staged, at the time, was the biggest trial in US history. And it was staged in San Francisco. And this was in 1918. And for the US part, the US at the time of World War was doing all it could to clamp down on domestic radicals, industrial workers of the world, various socialists, anybody who criticized the war. It was illegal to say anything against the war. So this was a campaign they were interested in, not just in terms of Indians, but generally. And, the Bolshevik Revolution had happened in Russia. And so they were worried about that contagion, spilling and affecting US domestic politics. So there was an opening for all of these kinds of reasons. There was an opening for the British to work with the US government to stage this trial. And the Brits paid for more than half of the expenses of this trial. I think it might have been.
I think it was in millions of dollars in that.
Yeah, it was huge. They brought in witnesses from India. San Francisco was filled with their spies. They tried to pass off a British operative who was one of their major spy dudes. I forget his exact position. He was sitting at the US prosecutor's table acting like a prosecutor when he was a British spy agency dude.
Wow.
So it was a huge deal, huge. And they were able to get a number of verdicts. So I just want to, the biggest thing I want to emphasize about this is it didn't just stay in India. And the concern wasn't just India. It was just generally the radical sort of atmosphere in the world at the time and trying to do everything could to stamp it out. So they definitely convicted a number of people. They were those people, one of whom was Traknath Das, Bhagwan Singh. I'm trying to remember some of the other names, but they were held at a prison.
Was the one who got killed by Ram Singh in a court, who was at that time leading, publishing the other party newspaper. I think they already split. There were two publications by then, I believe.
Okay.
So I mean, unless I don't want to go into too much details, but we will come to the implications of that trial, how it affected the naturalization. But before I go there, after reading your book, I found that the Lieutenant Governor of Punjab, Mr. O'Dwyer, who was a Home Secretary earlier, in charge of all the intelligence and working with William Hopkins. So this guy was monitoring all the rebels in America to neutralize their effects. So this information will not go back, even the Kamagata Maru incidents. I think we are going into that for sake of time, but people know more about it. So after reading your book, it feels like that what happened in Jallianwala Bagh massacre of 99 had roots with Ghadar party. Do
Yeah,
you agree with that?
I
Same people
do.
involved.
I've been trying to be pretty careful about the fact I am not a historian of India. I'm a Pacific
Okay.
Northwest immigration historian that sort of had to learn enough not to be an idiot about what I was writing, right? So, but looking at it, the authorities there in Punjab were saying, we got everything handled. It's not a problem anymore. We put down the insurgency, we've got this. And yet, when this gathering happened in 1919, they were so afraid that the contagion was still alive. The radical contagion, which is kind of what they called it, was still alive, and that it can continue to spread. And then just unleash this horrendous massacre against people, So they were not quite as secure as they claimed to be, because I think they knew what they were doing to people. They knew people were unhappy. How could you not be? You may deny it in your public face, but you know it, right? So
thank you for giving honest, answer. So let's move now back to America. Uh, so now this trial happens in San Francisco. There were convictions. I think there were more than 20 convictions.
yeah,
There were a few Germans, mostly some Punjabi and some Bengalis. Many people got convicted. And now the Congress in US passes a new act, a new law, which totally stops the migration from India. Do you think there was any influence of that the British were able to influence to stop, or there was just Americans didn't wanted people coming from India? So I think they completely closed the loopholes in the law, so the immigration completely stopped.
I
Any
would
thoughts
say
on that?
I would say yes. All of that. Both and yes, all of that. And I think looking at this history, it's this constant, like, they're independent interests of the US and the Brits at all times, but there's also all these convergences. They're both colonial empires, that's the thing. They're both based on the same issues of white supremacy and class supremacy. So, and then at wartime, they both had the issues of trying to keep the population in line. So the immigration law changes, those were, that was a progression of changes in laws, going into the war, through the war, and after the war. And one of the critical moments was, I think, which is what you're getting to, is Bhagat Singh Thinn's citizenship case.
Yeah.
And so I make a couple of arguments in that book, that, at this point, there were maybe 1,000 Punjabis left in the US, maybe. That's being generous. So why have this big case? Why make a big deal? Basically, what the US Supreme Court was doing during this period of time was, they'd already established, there's the whole issue of African Americans and citizenship and the Jim Crow laws and how that went. There was Native citizenship, Native American citizenship that wasn't really decided until the 20s. The Chinese had been banned in citizenship in the 1880s, but there was still like Japanese, Indians, Filipinos, and they were sort of going down the list trying to figure out. So there was a big, right before Bhagat Singh Thinn's case, there was a big case from Hawaii involving a Japanese man. That was slapped down because he wasn't, again, the criteria was, by their criteria, who was not white. And I want to emphasize again, whiteness is a fiction. It's just made up stuff that we make up. So, but there was some language in that ruling. That ruling was called Ozawa, made Tind and other Indians think, oh, well, we might have a chance because we have historically been considered Aryan,
Hmm.
which was a whole complicated theory about language and anthropology and all of those things. So he went to court being pretty hopeful, right? And got slapped down pretty decisively, in a
Hmm.
three-page verdict saying, look, there may be all these historical theories and linguistic theories about are you Aryan, are you not? But I'm looking at you and you are not white. That's the bottom.
Hmm.
Um, but so what was so interesting about Bhagat Singh 10 is there were other cases that were in the pipeline for Indian citizenship. Tind was closely associated with Ghadar. He was he was not there at the founding. He came after, but he was definitely an organizer and supporter.
I read in Miller's book that he was a secretary of the Oregon branch of Ghadar Party.
I don't think that's true.
Okay.
It may have been true after people left and he
No,
remained.
after later on, not at that time, because he
Yeah,
went there in 1914. He was not there in
yeah, yeah.
1913. Yeah.
That I think is true, but I think there's been a certain story out there that he was one of the founders. I don't believe
No,
that's
he's
true.
not. No, he was not at that meeting. That I agree
Yeah,
with you. Yeah.
yeah. And neither here nor there in a certain sense, right? But I forget where we were. So he was closely associated with Ghadar. He was an active proponent, supporter, worked in the office in San Francisco briefly here and there. He was also associated with the state where it started, not inconsequential, I don't think. So, of all the cases to pick up and take to the Supreme Court, I have a big question mark about was it just coincidence that his was chosen? You know, more importantly, I think, is that denying citizenship to Indians was a gift, whether it was intentional or not, it was a gift to the British regime.
Hmm.
It meant that Indians in this country did not have the thin protection of citizenship. And at that point, it was thin, to say the least. And then the US government used it for its own interests. I think the US interest was they were trying to get these various rulings in the Supreme Court, and the Department of Justice was openly calling on its attorney generals to send cases its way to get these kind of decisive rulings. This isn't me just guessing. They were asking for them.
Okay.
So,
To keep it short, I have a couple of more questions before we wrap it up. So just for our viewers, that Thind lost his Supreme Court case in 1923. I think there was Chief
right,
Justice Sutherland, and uh, the citizenship rights for people from Indian origin or British India were only allowed in 1946 under Lucy Seller Act, which was signed by President Harry Truman, and that was only applicable to people who were already here. So
Hmm.
people were not able to bring their families until 1966 under a new Nationalization Act, I think, which was signed by President Lyndon Johnson. So going back, Johanna, you have any summary or something we didn't ask you? You feel
You want
strong
to share? Hmm.
here?
so can I just give a couple more quick details? And I promise to be quick about 10 that I think are important.
Sure.
You
Sure,
can
sure, sure.
help me out later. One is that the 10 decision was used in the US to annul, to roll back, to get rid of. There were something like 70 Indians that already had citizenship. Those were nullified, which was a stunning development.
Wow.
I
Hmm.
don't think that has happened before. It's happening now. So that's one thing. And then the US Congress picked up that decision and said, okay, anybody that can't become a citizen, you can't even, they rewrote the immigration laws, not the naturalization laws, but the immigration laws to say, if you can't get citizenship, you can't come into the country. So they use that decision to shut the borders down. And the map, when you look at the map of who was banned for 20 some odd years from
Hmm.
even setting foot in this country is crazy. And it does have parallels to today in terms of part of what they used to set those immigration were quotas based on what America looked like in the 1890s. And there was this big fight in the legislative bodies to figure out what's the time period that we can guarantee that America is going to stay a white country. And we'll use those numbers to be able to set the quotas for the 1920s going forward. So, yeah, so Northern Europe, plenty. You know, the rest of the world, 100 from this country, 100 from this part of the world. They just shut the borders down with us. So,
Wow.
So anything else you want to add? We didn't ask you.
well, I just think, given the period that we're living through, I think this story is really important in um, thinking about underestimated people, heroic people, people that are sacrificing for a future. I think that's one thing that's important to think about. People that I think a lot of us would walk by on the street and not think they're going to change history. And I think we should sort of change our gaze a little bit. I also think that people should think about why it is that through the course of US history, not just in this time period we're talking about, but it's been this roller coaster of like, you have rights, you don't have rights. You can come in, you can't come in. And what's behind that? And what do we need to fight for and demand to stop that roller coaster? So I think that would be the things that are important to me.
So my last question is, you have any recommendations for Punjabi community or South Asian? I mean, at that time, India was much bigger, included other, which became other countries later on. So for in America, for those folks who have roots from that part of the world, what they need to do or should do to preserve that piece of history properly so it will not be lost. Any thoughts, recommendations?
Yeah, I tend to want to take recommendations from the community to me, sort of how to help with that. I think the kids are super important, you know. I've been trying to get this and have had some success with getting this curriculum into public schools here in Oregon. The Oregon Historical Society has been wonderful about helping to do that. But I think the kids are really important, you know. And I think knowing you have a place of belonging here is important. It's an important place to stand on as a part of fighting for a future of belonging here. So,
So Johanna, it's been a pleasure, and I can't thank you enough that you made so much time to talk to us. So I'm
Really,
going to
really.
just make some brief statement in Punjabi.
yeah.
ਸੋ ਮੇਰੀ ਸਾਰੇ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਸੁਣਨ ਵਾਲੇ ਭੈਣ ਭਰਾਵਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਹੱਥ ਜੋੜ ਕੇ ਬੇਨਤੀ ਆ ਵੀ ਇੰਨੀ ਸਾਡੀ ਜ਼ਰੂਰੀ ਤੇ ਇੰਨੀ ਅਹਿਮ
Kitab.
ਜਿਹੜੀ ਹਿਸਟਰੀ ਹੈ ਇਸ ਕੰਟਰੀ 'ਚ ਕੈਲੀਫੋਰਨੀਆ 'ਚ ਓਰੇਗਨ ਵਾਸ਼ਿੰਗਟਨ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ 'ਚ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ ਇਹ ਸਾਡਾ ਫਰਜ਼ ਹੈ ਇਹਨੂੰ ਸਾਂਭਣਾ ਤੇ ਖਾਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਮੈਂ ਉਹ ਭੈਣ ਭਰਾ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਿ ਗਦਰੀ ਬਾਬਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਫੰਕਸ਼ਨਸ ਕਰਵਾਉਂਦੇ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਹੱਥ ਜੋੜ ਕੇ ਬੇਨਤੀ ਹੈ ਵੀ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਜਾਣਕਾਰੀ ਹੈ ਇਹਨੂੰ ਸੀਰੀਅਸਲੀ ਸਟੱਡੀ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਅਸੀਂ ਅਕਸਰ ਬੜਾ ਲਾਈਟਲੀ ਉਹ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਕਰ ਲੈਂਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਤੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਗਹਿਰਾਈ 'ਚ ਜਾਣ ਦੀ ਲੋੜ ਆ ਤੇ ਇਹਦੇ 'ਚੋਂ ਬਹੁਤ ਕੁਝ ਸਿੱਖਿਆ ਜਾ ਸਕਦਾ ਤੇ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਗਲਤੀਆਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਕੀਤੀਆਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਅਸੀਂ ਸਿੱਖ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਵੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਉਹ ਗਲਤੀਆਂ ਦੁਬਾਰਾ ਨਾ ਕਰੀਏ ਤੇ ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਸਾਰੀ
Exactly.
ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਇਕੱਠੀ ਹੋ ਕੇ ਕੰਮ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੀ ਹੈ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਉਹ ਬਹੁਤ ਵੱਡੀਆਂ ਕੁਰਬਾਨੀਆਂ ਬਹੁਤ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਫਾਂਸੀਆਂ ਲੱਗੀਆਂ ਬਹੁਤ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੇ ਆਪਣੀਆਂ ਸਾਰੀ ਜ਼ਿੰਦਗੀਆਂ ਜੇਲ੍ਹਾਂ 'ਚ ਕੱਢੀਆਂ ਤੇ ਉਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਉੱਥੇ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਚਿੰਗਾਰੀ ਸੀਗੀ ਇੱਕ ਇਕੁਆਲਿਟੀ ਦੀ ਫਰੀडम ਦੀ ਲੋਕਾਂ 'ਚ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸ਼ੁਰੂਆਤ ਕੀਤੀ ਮਤਲਬ ਇਹ ਹਿਸਟਰੀ ਇਹ ਟੌਪਿਕ ਸੈਪਰੇਟ ਹੈਗਾ ਵੀ ਇੰਡੀਆ 'ਚ
Hmm.
ਹੋਇਆ ਸੀ ਰਾਈਟ ਨਾਓ ਸਾਡਾ ਫੋਕਸ ਸੀਗਾ ਵੀ USA ਤੇ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ 'ਚ ਕੀ ਹੋਇਆ so Johanna I really want to thank you I was just telling my community that it's on us to save this legacy of those folks who made so much sacrifices and
Sacrifice.
suffered so much and we need to preserve their legacy and learn and not to do the same mistakes again. So
Yeah.
that's how we can make America a great country. It's a great country to even make it better for everyone, and for the whole humanity. We need to learn
Yeah.
how to respect each other's right and coexist and work together.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you very much. Thank you for putting 10 years of your life in this history and giving us such a valuable information, which us Punjabis also didn't know till this time. So a lot of new stories, new information came out with your research, and we will ever be grateful to you for that.
I learned a lot. I learned a whole lot about the place I thought I knew. So,
Yeah. Well,
thank you
yeah.
both so very much. I really, really appreciate it. And anytime I can be of help, please call me. So,
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
thank you. Bye bye.
ਡਾਕਟਰ ਖਾਨ ਬਹੁਤ ਬਹੁਤ ਧੰਨਵਾਦ। ਸੋ ਬਹੁਤ ਸ਼ੁਕਰੀਆ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ, ਤੇ ਆਪਾਂ ਹੁਣ ਇਜਾਜ਼ਤ ਲੈਂਦੇ ਹਾਂ। ਸਭ ਨੂੰ ਪਿਆਰ ਭਰੀ ਸਤਿ ਸ਼੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ।